Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this crazy planet, wrapped in so many layers of turbulence and consequential dynamics, it's hard to count them. Geopolitical, climatic, etc. And here in America, it's been crazy time for quite a long time, with the second term of Trump unfolding. So I guess, I don't know, whenever it was 8 months ago, I heard from Paul Greenberg, a writer who I know best for his great work on fishing and fish and sustainability, and a book he also wrote on shutting off your devices, like the ones you're probably on now. Um, and he's written a novella. And Paul, actually, I can't remember if you've written other fiction, and you're speculating on a very interesting idea. Trump and others have floated scenarios for him to have a third term. Steve Bannon, particularly,
Yep.
has laid this out in very concrete terms. So just talk us through, and then we'll get into the details of the book. But
Sure.
you've basically written a third term, and it's a book about several things that come together at once:
Yeah.
science and fiction. And here we go.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Paul, what the heck is going on here?
Well,
Uh,
so okay, so you framed me correctly. I'm primarily an environmental journalist, although my very first book was a novel that I wrote long ago. But in this case, what happened was, believe it or not, I wrote this book 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, I was watching the campaign, the first re-election campaign for Trump, and I was watching it unfold, and I was hearing the absurd things that Trump was saying, like that you could inject ammonia into your veins to cure COVID and so forth. And I was thinking, gosh, this guy, his followers are so loyal that even if George Washington himself were to be brought back from the past, that they might actually vote for Trump rather than George Washington. And then that idea sort of stuck with me. And I was like, that's kind of an interesting premise. So I wrote this whole novella. And, Andy, before we got online, we were talking about how hard writing is. And usually I find writing very hard. But this was the first time where it was actually as if I was just taking dictation. And the book flew out of me in a month. And then this is 2020, remember, and I tried to publish it. Everybody liked it, but nobody wanted to touch it. And so I saw that Biden won, and I put it back in the drawer, and I thought, okay, well, that's that for a third term.
right.
Well, cut to 4 years later, and a private foundation that had read the book in draft form said, you know what, I think you should bring this book out. And so I got a little grant. And step by step, got Barry Blitt, who does the New Yorker covers, with Trump on them. He signed on to do the cover. Got a
Yeah.
great actor, voiceover guy to do the audio book, who's Tony nominated actor named Bray Poor. And so then it just all kind of came together, and I put it out, and now it's been, I put it out just before the election, hoping that it might sway a few people. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Clearly not enough. And now, as Trump regularly beats the drum of a third term, I decided, to just kind of keep going with it. The other thing, that the paradigm sets up is that, of course, George Washington set the precedent of limiting presidential terms to two, and he willfully stepped down. There was nothing in the Constitution that would have forbade him from running for a third term. But Washington was exhausted. He didn't want any part of it anymore. He was looking forward to a retirement, one that was cut short by an ill-timed visit to a whiskey still in a snowstorm. And then, so it sets up an interesting paradigm. So obviously, the 22nd Amendment, after Roosevelt ran for 4 terms, limited the presidency to 2 terms. So Trump, if he were to seek a third term, would be in violation of the Constitution. That seems to be no problem for him. And then, so what I thought it was sort of interesting is to play out that scenario where you have, on the one hand, George Washington, who doesn't really want a third term, who's been pulled from the mansions of rest to run again. And then you have this person who actually is never identified as Trump. He's just referred to as the tyrant, desperately wanting to hold on to power and to claim a third term. So it's a pretty fertile place to play around with as a writer. And I can safely say this more than I can say of many other books, that I enjoyed writing it.
That's exciting to know. Yeah, I'd love to stumble onto a topic
Right?
I've been thinking about fiction a little bit because the world is beyond fact.
That's right.
Changing minds with facts doesn't seem to work anyway, as
Yep.
we probably learned. So why not try something different? Um, had you already dug in on the history? Like, how did this idea crystallize? Because you bring back George Washington technologically.
Yeah.
Uh, so,
Well,
so, so just take us back. So you had this idea. What was the crystallizing idea?
so first of all, your kids are a little older than my kid, but I grew up as a parent under the influence of the musical Hamilton. And so, whenever we drive somewhere, we were forever listening to Hamilton again and again and again. And thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, most kids my son's age, who's now 18, already intuitively know the fight over the central bank, for example, which was a rap battle, I think, in Hamilton. So I was already, the character of Washington in Hamilton, the musical, was already something of an iconic voice in my head. When I decided, though, that I wanted to write this book, I did read the Hamilton's author, who's Ron Chernow, also wrote a Washington biography. So I read his Washington biography. I read another book about Washington as a slave owner, and as readers will find that does come up. So that sort of came into being. My brother is a horror and sci-fi Hollywood writer. He wrote Pet Sematary, Halloween H2O, Reign of Fire, things like that. So sci-fi is always in my mind. But unlike my brother, who has all sorts of fancy bells and whistles that he's always calling upon to write his scripts, I kind of skate over it. I think I just refer to that there's an anomaly that scientists have discovered. They find it out right after the March for Science, and that they can tap into this anomaly only once. And so there's a big question as who we're going to bring back. And so they settle on Washington.
And the idea is somehow that he would have the gravitas to defy what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's the fun part of it, right? Is that, he's not a shoo-in at all in this election. And at one point, there's a passage, one of my favorite passages, and I'll just do it from memory rather than rifling through the book. But at one point, it's, he's revealed to the public, and the tyrant says, well, let's play this out. Let's say he is who he is. I mean, what does that mean? And then in the back of their mind, all his campaign managers are saying, if he is who he says he is, he's the fucking founder of our country and a brick shithouse full of kryptonite. But the tyrant goes on. He says, who he is, who he is, who is he? Mr. Out of Touch, bunch of wooden teeth, no kids, probably shot blanks. So all these, things that I'm sure that the current president would think of. But of course, the other thing I think that is fun to play with, and as we've seen, is that this president there's no limit to the ways he can find indignation. And so, he might on one level think he's better than everyone else, but on the other level, especially with Washington, he's constantly reminded everywhere. There's the Washington Monument, there's Washington on the quarter, there's Washington on the dollar. He's everywhere. So that this gets under his skin and causes him, well, I don't want to give anything away, but it creates some problems for the tyrant.
Right. Now, who is there a way? Well, tell me about some of the podcasts you've been on, because I was going to ask you, is there a way to ensure this book is read by more than people who are eager?
Yeah, well, so I've been on a very long before I did fish or environment or fiction, even, I was actually a Soviet studies major back in the day, and you and I are old enough to know what that is, but some don't. And anyway, I was very intrigued by the idea of the Soviet concept of the samizdat. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but so back in the bad old Soviet days, the way books went hand to hand that were not sanctioned by the government was through these mimeographed, hand passed around copies. So like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Pasternak, all these great authors, Varlam Shalamov, they all kind of got passed hand to hand. And so at a certain point, I started to think about this book. In this country, there's a tradition of the sort of self-published book that is kind of boring and usually written by some old fogey who was CEO of Luminous and industries, and
Right.
he gets some hack writer to write the biography for him and then self-publishes. But what I found is there's this whole alternate structure of publishing coming up, which can also be referred to as independent publishing. And so doing that, I've been exposed to a whole range of experts who are sort of about getting the word out. And so we were talking before we started recording, there's this thing, for example, called Podmatch, which matches you up with all the people who have podcasts. And so I've been on these crazy podcasts. I've been on libertarian podcasts. I've been on MAGA podcasts. I had such a heartfelt conversation with a podcast. The guy was a 20-year Army veteran and had been in Bosnia and Iraq and in Afghanistan. We actually turned out we had been in Bosnia together because I used to work for nonprofits in Eastern Europe. And he was just like, he goes, I feel politically homeless. And that's why your book spoke to me, because, what Washington is meant to represent in this novella is just some sanity. You know what I mean? Not crazy basket of fringe ideas that we see on the right and the left, but where most Americans are, and that we want somebody who's decent, somebody who's honest, and most of all, somebody who actually thinks about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I mean, that's like military leadership, actually, incarnate.
Right.
The guy was speaking of, the vet from all those three wars, was saying it has sort of done a little bit of a research around presidents who served in the Army and presidents who didn't. And the ones who did serve, because they had that sort of trial by fire. I'm not saying that every president has to have been a military veteran, but think about it. As a leader, particularly in a leader during combat, literally lives are at stake. And for somebody who's not had to lead people into combat, I think the idea of loss of life, sacrificing, suffering can be abstract. So to me, Washington was the ultimate vet and the ultimate person who thought about the greatest good for the greatest many.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to give away the plot either, but
Sure.
there are twists, and there's a political push with Washington involved to get at this who ends up in the third term, and this issue character has come up. I've done a few podcasts, even though my focus is sustainability. I've been really focusing on the sustainability of democracy as part of that. And one thing that came up was that our Constitution and the foundational documents rely on the values of the people who are in government. That there's the plasticity that makes our democracy durable and agile and adaptable. The American form also makes it vulnerable to immorality. And can you talk about that as a theme? It's not just funny. It's there's a biting aspect to what's going on too.
Absolutely. It's as my late father used to say, you don't know whether to laugh or cry, but it's for sure true. And as we've seen in these last 5 months of the Trump administration 2.0, that so much of what we thought was sort of bedrock was actually civility. You know what I mean? And actually kind of a compact that you listen to judges when they make a decision. If they say you're wrong, you assume you're wrong, right? So I think when you have somebody in power who does not have a moral center, and the kind way of putting it is that that we have a president who's essentially transactional, right? That's the nice way of putting it, and It makes it seem like business. But at the end of the day, I don't think that morals and moral value is transactional, right? Like there, at a certain point, somebody has to have a core of something that they truly believe in. And I think you can say what you will about Washington as a person. And certainly, actually, this was something of a hurdle when I first tried to sell the book back in 2020, because back then, remember, that was the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. My agent in particular, who liked the book and has been a supporter, was like, I don't know if she should be floating Washington as a hero at this point when everybody's talking about him as a slave owner. So that was certainly, and that comes up in the book. But I think there is enough evidence, as Chernow and others biographers have pointed out, to attest to Washington's fiber as a person. He used to say, he said during the Revolution, we fought with halters about our necks. And that's such a resonant line for me, that Washington knew if he were ever caught, captured, or defeated, he would be hung, and he would be hung not like in the manner of, a vanquished hero, but like a common brigand. And so his honor stood above all that. I mean, I think it was Lin-Manuel Miranda cites it in Hamilton. But I think it's true that George III said there's nobody else in their country who looms quite as large. And even though George III never met Washington, first of all, George Washington was exceptionally tall, so he did truly loom large. But I think he loomed morally large. And it's interesting how even without the internet or any sort of other way of kind of conveying charisma and strength, that somehow he was able to convey it,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's nonsense. I think that true charisma, true strength is endlessly attractive, and I think Washington had those qualities.
Yeah, I'm showing an image I found online of
On the deathbed.
the death of George Washington. This dates from 1799. This print, apparently.
Yeah, and that's by the way, that's how the book begins. Is that I think the first line is something like, just before his first death, George Washington allowed himself one last mistake. And mistake is key here, right? Because he makes the sort of technical mistake he makes is going out in a snowstorm to tend to a whiskey still. And then, as history will tell us, he contracted severe pneumonia, he was bled, and all these kind of improper things, and eventually died. But the book really focuses on Washington's realization of his own mistakes in his life, particularly with respect to slavery. And that's, of course, me monkeying around a bit with history. We don't know that Washington ever had a kind of come to Jesus moment with his existence as a slave owner. But it's kind of a necessary exorcism, I think. And rather than kind of haul up Washington to be burned in effigy during periods of racial awareness and all these kinds of things, I think we have to look at him as the whole person, and understand that his mistakes were kind of our mistakes as a country, and to pin it all on him is kind of a little bit short-sighted.
Absolutely. Were there, on your podcast discussions of this with more of the sort of libertarian other crowds, was there a pushback or common ground, or
what I found really interesting on both the MAGA and libertarian and just general discussions is that I have come to the conclusion that this supposed divided country we have is entirely the manufactured product of Fox News and, sure, why not MSNBC, at least in response. But that when you speak eye to eye with people about this, whether they be vets or libertarians or whatever, there are some very serious common grounds about things that don't sit well. Like, nobody likes the idea of Trump seeking a third term. Everyone agrees. There's I often point out that Washington was an exceptionally brave individual, and there are firsthand accounts of Washington rushing ahead of his troops into battle at the French and Indian War in the 1760s and returning, with much of his troops mowed down. But Washington returns with his field tunic full of musket holes, and people to this day don't really know how he survived the charge. As I say on a couple of these podcasts, I don't see Donald Trump ahead on his horse in front of everyone taking first fire, and everyone agrees, because keep in mind, I'm talking to a lot of people who are former military, and they understand what military leadership looks like. So I think there is a lot to agree on about all this, especially again when you talk about questions of character, which is entirely visible no matter how you try to disguise it. That there's some serious character issues coming up in this second Trump administration as well as in the first.
Yeah, that seems pretty crystalline. This issue of finding common ground is something I've been writing about a lot, and I had a conversation months ago. Let me just play this to see what you think.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will work. I think the audio should work. Let me know if you hear.
Yeah.
And I were on some point
hearing that
and just looking at it. And
okay, so I'll set it up. This is Reggie Harris, who's a singer, songwriter, folky, historian, storyteller, who back in 2020, Reggie was in this podcast was describing confrontation as a Black Lives Matter rally was getting going on the same green in upstate New York as a MAGA rally. And he and this other guy were toe to toe and kind of getting hot under their collars, someone from the MAGA rally. And there were friends egging them on almost. And then Reggie said the following, which is so interesting.
He and I were on some point and just going at it. And I just could feel myself completely losing control. And I thought, this is not why you came out here. So, and I couldn't figure out how to disengage, because now we were in, and there were a couple of his, Trump supporting friends who were nearby, and they were sort of egging him on. And finally, in the midst of one exchange, this wonderful thing happened. And I just said to him, "Hi, my name is Reggie." And he looked at me and he said, "What?" "My name is Reggie." And he said, "Oh, I'm Ed." And I said, "Good to meet you." And he said,
Exactly.
"Good to meet you too." And then that breath gave us an opportunity to sort of settle. And then I said, "Look, I hear you. You were saying you're a veteran, and you said you were a truck driver. I'm a musician. I travel around the country. We're probably buying gas at the same rate." And he said, "Yeah, that's probably true." And so we started talking about gas prices and having to keep our vehicles fueled, and it gave us some place to go. And then the other folks fell away, and we actually talked for half an hour. And now each of us were trying to find points to agree on.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I often refer to a quote by a British philosopher named Charles Mackay. He said, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one," which to me is just exactly what that clip shows, right?
Yeah.
Is that when we think of the enemy as this horde instead of a collection of individuals with sensibilities of their own, then we just that's how propaganda works, right?
Right.
So I think what Reggie's describing is exactly spot on. And I think that's in a way what I'm trying to do with this book, insofar as push away MAGA, push away the supporters, the way things get contorted and converted, and just have it be mano a mano, Washington and this tyrant. And at one point during the first debate, and again, I won't give too much away, but the host, who, by the way, the host has got the White House in his IFB, and by this point in 2028, the media is totally bought over. But at one point he says, what is the main, something like, to Washington, what is the main issue that you think is difference divides you two? And Washington says, "There's but one issue, and that is an issue of character." And he stops, and the host is like, "And?" He's like, "That is all." And he said, "But you have another 2 minutes. I don't require them." So, which is part of me also dancing around the fact that this is 2028, or the world of the novella is. I don't know what the frack is going to be the world in 4 years, and so so in a way I kind of skate over any entanglement to what could be. The only snafu I had, actually, and then this was funny, when I wrote the book back in 2020, I had at the Democratic National Convention, I had them wheel out Jimmy Carter at 103 in 2028, and and like he mumbles a speech and that nobody can understand. Well, of course, Carter died just recently, last year. So the nice thing about self-publishing or independently publishing is that you can go back and fix stuff. So I adjusted that so that Jimmy Carter was still alive. He didn't tell anyone. He was secreted away at a secret hospice facility because he didn't want to die under a Republican administration. So he crops up, like literally revived from the dead. But again, to kind of speak to the other major problem is the gerontocracy of both parties, and the fact that we won't let younger people in the room to kind of have a voice. You're seeing it play out, whether or not you like his politics. You're seeing this play out in the New York mayoral race with
Mamdani, yeah.
with Mamdani,
Yeah.
who's a very charismatic, interesting person that the Democratic establishment is totally tar and feathering, and let the
Right.
guy at least have a chance on the soapbox to see if he can win his case. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, although they kind of did that with Bernie Sanders, but
Sure they did. Of course they did.
of course,
No.
he's like an endless kid.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem that the Democrats have to face, right? Is that the greatest energy lies in this further to the left vision of things. That's Bernie to AOC, now to Mamdani.
Yeah.
And, they can pretend to ignore it and throw up gerontocratic people one after the other, or they can deal with it. I mean, I think one of the stupidest things that came up recently was that when Huma married the Soros guy, that was the first time we'd really seen Kamala Harris in public since the election. It's like, oh,
Right.
really? This is the message you want to convey to your electorate, that, we're just another oligarchic clique that goes to each other's weddings? No. I mean, we got to be,
Yeah.
Mamdani at least was in the freaking streets, arguing for, a cheaper halal sandwich.
Yeah, I'll tell you, and I'll say our 27-year-old son and his 27-year-old girlfriend in Brooklyn were out canvassing
Absolutely.
super aggressively for him, so that he is building a constituency, and they feel actually that son, Jack, he was a Bernie bro,
Yeah.
and then he became a Biden supporter
Yeah.
later. But now he's very much back in sort of the Bernie mode, facing.
Well, and how can't you be, for
Yeah.
like this, one funny thing about Washington is that when he's brought back from the past, he's a relatively spry late 60s, compared to Biden, who, I'm sure you saw the CNN book, the Jake Tapper book, and,
Right.
And read the George Clooney, or the New Yorker excerpt and so forth. I mean, that was a Shonda, it was for him to try to stick it out for another 4 years, and it's a great disappointment to all of us.
Yeah, is there anyone, when you look at your book, the character that Washington displays, and there's a vice presidential candidate, of course.
Yeah.
Is there anyone you see in the Democratic fold right now, at the national level, who even remotely feels like they have that power?
I kind of feel like I'm biased because I'm a native son of Connecticut, but I'm feeling good about the Connecticut team. I like Murphy. It was funny. I was invited to speak at an environmental law conference at Yale way back in 2024. And then by the time, of course, I got to the conference, there was it wasn't what aspect of environmental law are we discussing? It's, is there such a thing anymore as environmental law? And Attorney General Tong from Connecticut was very strong and good. And I was like, wow, this is what we need to do. I mean, who's to say, once you get into the jaws of the political machine, trying to kind of save your own character, as well as kind of going back to the top of the interview, do the greatest good for the greatest many, that's a really difficult thing, and it requires great acumen as well as great character. So I'd be a fool to game it out right now, but I have been impressed by Murphy, and we'll see what happens down the line. I just hope that we actually have a fair and open election, when it comes time to choose again. I mean, that's, to me,
Right.
as somebody, I worked in the former Soviet Union for a number of years. I saw how democracies die. And one way they usually die is by not just at the ballot box, but everything leading up to the ballot box, and the fairness, or just essential infrastructure that I think is going to come under severe attack in the next few years. So that's something we really need to watch.
I just thought we're getting toward the end because you have to get on with the day.
Yeah.
It was great that we could do this pop-up conversation, which I'll post on my blog afterwards. One thing, this week there's a promotion for your book, right? Can you describe it? I have the link.
Yeah. Well, so as part of this kooky self-publishing thing, this week only until Friday, because it's July 4th, and that's my birthday, by the way. For the July 4th week, the book on Kindle is free. And then we've also just dropped the audiobook, which is more, but not that much, not that expensive. And for those who want a physical book, you have to pay for it, but it is available in paperback. So hopefully people will find a way to it, and and reach out and try to start sharing it around.
That's great. And what I thought was the closest I've come to speculative fiction in this context is a song I just wrote recently.
Oh, nice.
It's really short. So let me, why don't I play it?
Put it on.
No, I'm going to play it.
put it on your lap.
Yeah. It's called Good News from 2044, question mark. So here we go. I mean, whatever. It's just my way of attacking these issues.
Yeah.
That's different than journalism.
Yeah.
Hold on. Hopefully the guitar won't overload the microphone. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never fell. Candidates for president are on the stump. Sasha Obama and Barron Trump. And that's not the weirdest thing I have to relate. They're both kind of sane and talking pretty straight. That change didn't happen on its own. Sun let out a flare and all the circuits were blown. AI fried, satellites died, people had to live without a telephone. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never fell. Of course that is a dream. The sun won't set us straight. It'll take a lot of work to really make this country great again. So join yourself a club or your PTA. Even run for office if you feel that way. Find yourself a goal that suits your skills and heart. That's how we'll take back the power from the oligarchs. I said find yourself a goal that suits your skills and heart. That's how we'll take back the power from the oligarchs. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never fell.
Perfect. Exactly. Yeah, you know, it's sometimes I always remember the moment when I was in the Soviet Union, and it was 1991, and I was making a sort of disruptive documentary on Lake Baikal, and the taxi driver came in the morning, and he said, "Did you hear? They took Gorbachev." And I thought, oh my God, wow, I'm going to be stuck in Siberia for the rest of my life. And then I did exactly what you did. I projected, well, where will I be in a year from now or 5 or whatever? I bet I'm not going to be in a prison in Siberia. So bravo to you, Andy, for taking us there.
Well, it's so interesting that you bring up these lessons from history. And one of the other shows I did was on autocracy vital signs. There's a team in Europe who measure the vital signs of countries around the world. Are we heading toward democracy or toward autocracy? And there are dynamics that determine the difference. And
That's right.
And it's people activating people in the streets, yes, but it has to be in the business sector, has to be in the courts, it has to be a sort of a full sphere of activism, and as you were saying earlier, a sense of values. A point when it's not just profit, and it's not just your interests, but the interests of sustaining the system around us. So thanks, Paul Greenberg, for diverting into political speculative fiction with this book, A Third Term. And I'm glad to hear you're going fishing next week with a good mutual friend.
Yep.
Getting back to your conservation and fishing roots, and maybe we can revisit sometimes soon going forward.
That sounds great, Andy. Thanks for finding a little time for me today, and great
to
hear your voice in prose and in song, which I've never heard before. So thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, and I'll send you the. I'm trying to record some of these tunes to get them out around too.
Please do.
This is Andy Revkin. This was a pop-up Sustain What webcast on a book of speculative and quasi-hopeful fiction about George Washington riding sort of to the rescue, facing a modern day tyrant. And more, you can find out more at that link, paulgreenberg.org/books. And there's a special on this week. You can get the online textbook free of charge briefly. Thanks again. This is Andy Revkin signing off. Hold on a second.